Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today is one of my 2021 wrap-up style videos. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about my biggest surprises for 2021. So these, out of all of the books that I read, were the ones that genuinely surprised me by how much they drew me in, how much I liked them. And there were a couple of different reasons for this. It could have been a book that I had been pushing off for a long time and then finally read it and found that all of my fears were unfounded. Or perhaps it was an author that I hadn't really heard a whole lot about. And so even getting to read a book by them and then enjoying it so much was a big surprise for me. There are tons of different reasons, and there's a pretty good variety in the books that I have here. They come from a couple of different genres, but I will talk about each of the 6 books that surprised me the most this year and the reasons why they did so. So I'm going to do a follow-up video for this that is going to be a biggest disappointments of 2021, and you will see that video within the next couple of days. But the very first surprise for me was a book that I read very early in the year, and it's actually a graphic novel. So this was the graphic novel, The Vision, the complete series by Tom King. This is a graphic novel that I actually bought for my husband last year for Christmas and then read it shortly afterward. My husband likes to read comic books, but as anybody who has ever read comic books or who follows comic books regularly knows, there is a lot. So there is a lot of volume put out in terms of all of the different branches, all of the different superheroes. There's just so much to try to wade through. So what I try to do every year is find a few based on the heroes that I know he likes that are more standalone-ish. So you need to have a basic concept of who the hero is and what their place is in their particular universe, but you don't need to know, what has happened for the last 50 runs or the last big events for the world. And one of the comic books that I had found when I was looking last year was this collection called The Vision. And I think I ended up buying it for him because I knew that the WandaVision show was on the horizon, and I had heard that maybe they took some of the concepts from this comic, and I thought it would be cool to read it before the show came out. And I think we both liked it, but I ended up liking it a lot more than Andrew did. And I think it's because this comic was suited to my particular tastes. It ended up feeling, it's a very short graphic novel. It's a compilation, I think, of 6 volumes. Or 6 issues. It might be 8 issues, but regardless, it is a pretty slim volume. You need to have a basic understanding of the Marvel universe, but nothing too intense. You don't need to be a long-time comic book fan in order to enjoy it. But what really surprised me about it was the depth of the story. I was not expecting it to feel so literary. It's incredibly nihilistic. It ruminates on a number of existential themes, the idea of humanity and what makes a family and what is worth living for. And it was just a really good book to start off the year with. I remember enjoying it so much. I had a great time reading it, but it was also really sad. It was dark. It was bleak. I ended up really loving it. And this is not to say that I don't like comic books. I do. I enjoy graphic novels. I spent a time about 10 years ago where I read a lot of graphic novels, and I feel like I was really up on the major plot lines and stories that were happening within Marvel. But I fell out of that. I find it really hard to keep on top of, but I was really happy to have picked this one up. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think if you have kind of your basic knowledge of the Marvel universe and you're looking for a graphic novel that has surprising depth, then this one is a good one to pick up. The second book that was a big surprise for me, and I actually have talked about this being a big surprise in the past, so sorry for repeating myself, but this is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is I don't even know what we want to call it. It's not really historical fantasy. I guess it's high fantasy. There are magical creatures, there's magic, there's prophecy. but it is a fantasy story that is based on the pre-Columbian Americas, and it is a type of fantasy story unlike a lot that I have read. I think that I have been trying to expand my fantasy repertoire as I catch up on a lot more modern fantasy. One of the things that I really like is seeing so much diversity, seeing fantasy diverge into different types of stories than the traditional ones that we have come to expect over the last couple of decades. And Black Sun was something that definitely fit this bill. I picked it up on a whim because it was available as an audiobook from my library. I had been looking, I think I was either going for a drive or I was doing something where I thought that I would need an audiobook. And this one was just, when I checked like what's currently available on my Libby app, this was one of the ones that popped up. And I thought, well, I haven't really heard of this, but I will give it a listen. And when I did, I just really enjoyed it. I thought that the audiobook was good to start with. I hadn't really been listening to a whole lot of audiobooks at that time, so I was pleasantly surprised by the narration. I thought that the plot was very well done. It starts off a little more slowly, and what you are reading about is a group of people who are, you believe, are kind of destined to come together, and we're moving towards a point in the book called the convergence. And so it is this literal convergence of I believe it's of the planets or the sun or something is happening out there in space, and it is also a convergence of the characters within the story, and it's full of tension. The characters are very vibrant. There are a couple that I ended up liking more than others, but I really enjoyed everybody's perspective, and it was just so nice to find a book that I had not built up any hype about, that I had not had any expectations for, and when I ended up reading it, I really enjoyed it. I was super excited to get to book 2. I included the second book in the series on my most anticipated list of 2022, and I'm genuinely thinking about rereading the first book before going into the second. Even though I do remember a lot of the details because it does stand out clearly to me, I enjoyed it enough to read it kind of in back-to-back years. And because I have so many books on my TBR, I feel like that speaks a lot for how much I liked the book. But this was definitely a surprise. I hadn't read any Rebecca Roanhorse before. I know that she is a well-known author. She just wasn't particularly well-known to me. So I am glad that I found her. I am looking forward to reading more of her work. The third book on this list is a work of more traditional or classic fantasy, and that is The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding. I want to say that it is a surprise that I liked it because I had not heard of it. So I guess it was a surprise in that it came on my radar and I picked it up, almost immediately, and I ended up really enjoying it, but it is the kind of book that I would enjoy. So I don't know, this one's kind of like a soft surprise because I had never heard of it before, and I picked it up and I was really pulled in by it. But if you read the back of the book, then it does seem like the kind of story that I would like. This is a fantasy story that follows two best friends, and they live in an occupied country. So there have been these colonists who have come in and occupied their country, and there is this kind of stratified social system where the people who used to live in the country are on one rung of the hierarchy, and then you have the invaders who are kind of in the upper echelons of society. And our main characters are people who are from this country, but one of them is a nobleman. So he has been given certain privileges and he has some standing in society, while his friend is very poor and he is looked down on as kind of one of the dregs of society. And there is an inciting incident that happens that gets both of them in trouble, and they get sent to a forced labor camp. And what happens is there's a lot of different things going on at once. We get a plot that is kind of heist driven. So you get a heist type story where you get a group of characters coming together who want to steal an artifact. But you also get this examination of friendship because our two main characters whose names are Aaron and Cade are best friends. But there's this weird dynamic between them at the beginning because they are from two different rungs of society. And that dynamic shifts as the story progresses, and they're both struggling to find their place. They're struggling to figure out how they should relate to each other, and I really love friendships in fantasy, and I really enjoyed what Chris Wooding did with this one. This is a pretty chunky book, so we had a good 800 or 900 pages for the characters in here to be fleshed out fairly well. It is long, but I never felt like it dragged. It did feel somewhat episodic. The book does feel like it is separated into distinct parts. So we have part A that takes place at a certain, place and time. Then we have part B where everyone's doing something else. And then part C, which is kind of our resolution. So if you don't like books that feel very episodic like that, then that could be something that might push you away. But I really ended up liking it. I thought the pacing was great. It tugged a lot of emotion out of me. I really felt for the successes and the plights of the characters. This is going to be an ongoing series, but the first book does work pretty well as a standalone. But Chris Wooding has announced, I think, that he's either finished the first draft or very nearly finished the first draft. So hopefully that means that book 2 is not too far away in the future. I will be very, very excited when book 2 comes out, and I was really happy that I got to pick up this book this year. I would love to have a hardcover copy. This is the disappointing thing when you read books that are a little bit under the radar. It's harder to find nicer copies. I am happy to have a print copy, but I would die for a hardback. Would love to have a hardback of this novel. The next story on my list is another new to me author, and this is the book Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. This is an author that I first heard of on Angela's channel over at the Literature Science Alliance. She had been talking about their work and how much she enjoyed it. And I hadn't really heard of them. And I think I had just discovered Angela's channel as well. So I believe I watched a video by her and then went out to visit my sister and went to the bookstore while I was out in town. And I saw this book by River Solomon on the shelf, and it was so beautiful. The cover was so pretty. It's this kind of dark blue and purple cover with flowers, and it looked so pretty. And so I bought it. And what I found inside was a stark contrast to the cover, because this was a dark, creepy, genre-blending fantasy horror story, and I loved it. I really like things that are weird. You could probably guess, one of my favorite fantasy series of all time is The Dark Tower. I don't think you get any weirder than that in terms of a fantasy series. So what Rivers Solomon did with their story was create something that to me felt very reminiscent in tone to The Dark Tower, just in terms of mixing those different genres and you not really being able to guess what is going to happen next, but completely different in story. This is very much a story of a young woman who has to make her own way, who has to discover who she is outside her family, who grapples with the ideas of motherhood, of being a daughter. There's a lot to say about it's kind of like the cult mindset. So she grows up in a cult on a compound, and there's a very interesting balance of, I understand that horrible things were done to me as a child, and I resent that, but these are also the only people that I know, and I love them, and I know that, in their way, they also love me. So there's a lot of really complex themes about family and belonging, and it just blew me away. And I was really drawn in. I was not expecting to love it as much as I did. It is one of my favorite new releases that I read in 2021, second only to The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, but it's John Gwynne. So, I mean, there's no shame in being one under John Gwynne on my list. But I totally expected to love John Gwynne. I had no idea I was going to love Rivers Solomon. So, Sorrowland was a definite win in my case. The fifth entry on this list is a little bit different, and that is a manga. So I read the ending of Haikyuu this year. So I'm going to include volume 45 of Haikyuu on this list. And Haikyuu was a big surprise for me. I know I'm talking about books, but just in terms of everything, Haikyuu was a big surprise for me this year. So I watched Haikyuu, which, if you do not know, is a sports anime, this year, and I watched all of the seasons that are currently out, which I think is 4. And then when I was finished, I loved it so much and I wanted to know what happened so much that I bought the final volumes of the manga and continued on to read from, let me see if I can tell from over there on my bookshelf. I think it's I can see volume 38, but I don't know if there's some other ones that I can't see. But somewhere in like from the 30s to 45 was the chunk of the manga that had not been adapted that I read. And Haikyuu was just a delightful surprise all around. I really like anime, which is probably not a surprise. I've done a couple of videos talking about that and comparing books to anime, but I don't watch a lot of sports anime. My anime tends to be more kind of fantasy or sci-fi related. And it was just a big surprise overall. I really loved the anime. It was very feel good. I do really love sports movies, like inspirational sports movies. So I think that that translated well. This was very much an underdog story. It's about a boy named Shoyo who wants to be a volleyball player, but he is very, very short. And so he has to try to overcome this challenge that he has and become one of the best volleyball players in Japan or the world. And it's just about his perseverance, how hard he works. I really love stories like that. He was a great protagonist, and I don't read a lot of manga. I don't think I've read one completed manga series ever in my entire life, but I would like to read more because I really like anime. I just find I really like the visual aspect, and I worry sometimes, especially with ones that are more popular, that if I read the manga first, then maybe I won't like the anime as much. And I think I prefer the anime as a medium, but I am going to try to discover more. I also watched and loved Vinland Saga this year, so I definitely want to continue on with that story. But I'm getting a little bit off topic. I just want to say I really liked Haikyuu. It was one of my favorite or best surprises of 2021. And for the final surprise, I have to move my notebook because it's not up far enough. I should have known which one I had on there. But number 6 is Dune. This was the best kind of surprise because it was made all the sweeter by the fact that I had put it off for so long, and I was so frightened of reading it because I thought that I was not going to like it. Frank Herbert's Dune is the book that everybody has been reading this year because the adaptation is coming out. It is a classic, a staple in the sci-fi genre. It is a work of science fiction that incorporates a lot of fantasy tropes. The character arcs are very fantasy-esque, so I think it's one that has a lot of crossover appeal for fantasy fans. I have long been more hesitant about science fiction than I am about fantasy because to me, I like the thematic exploration in fantasy. I like the hero's journey. I like the character arcs and archetypes that we find in fantasy. But I do find it a little bit more difficult to find that same level of investment in science fiction. I've read a lot of the kind of classic works of sci-fi, and I like them. I enjoy them, but it always takes me longer to get through them, and I feel like I am satisfied at the end. I feel accomplished when I get to the end of one, but I'm not like, oh my God, I love this. I need more of it, which is how I feel a lot of the time when I read fantasy. But for Dune, I think it's because it includes some of those common fantasy tropes, some of those common fantasy archetypes, but I really loved Dune. I was really happy that I read it. I had been worried that it was going to be dry. I did not find it dry. I worried that the writing style was going to be not accessible. It was incredibly accessible. And I think this was just a case of kind of reverse hype. I had been building up this fear for so long that it seemed much less dry and much easier to read in comparison because I had been expecting it to be so tough. But I really loved it. I thought one of the things that holds me back from science fiction a lot of the time is I don't feel incredibly connected to the characters. But any of the usual struggles that I have with sci-fi about the characters seeming aloof or there being a little bit of an abundance of exposition, let's say. The things that happened in Dune, I felt like really fit in with the magic system that was built up, the way that people think about things and break them down very analytically. I think that worked as part of the character development. And so some of those things in the writing that I may not have liked as much in another story, I thought worked really, really well in Dune. But I have been wanting to read this book for decades. It is one of the books that was on my TBR the longest. I've wanted to read it since I was a teenager. And finally this year I did, and I really loved it. Happy to report that it was one of my favorite books of the year, one of my favorite science fiction books that I have ever read, and an excellent way to end out this list because I just thought that it was truly phenomenal. But those are the 6 books that I was most surprised by in 2021. I am so happy to have discovered these 6 books. If you enjoy the things that I said about them when I was describing them, then I would obviously wholeheartedly recommend all of these. These are some of my favorite books that I read throughout the year. And I would love to know if there were any books that totally took you by surprise this year, whether it was an author that you hadn't heard of or a book that maybe you had built up to be something that it wasn't. I would love to hear it in the comments below, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye.